Hello, and welcome to the Pacific Center podcast. My name is Dr. Greg Lane, and I will be your host as we explore many interesting topics with many amazing people from a variety of professional backgrounds over the months and years ahead. The focus of this podcast will be the intersection of the traditional healthcare practices of various cultures and the modern scientific research on peak physical and cognitive performance. The show will be delivered in an interview format. A quick disclaimer, while we may be discussing some health-related issues and therapies, in no way will this be construed as medical advice. As always, if you're seeking information or treatment for a medical condition, please consult with a licensed healthcare provider. Our guest today is Dr. Joe Tafur, founder of Nihue Rao, psychoneuroimmunology, integrative medicine, family medicine, traditional Amazonian plant medicine. Dr. Tafur is an integrative-minded family physician and founding partner of Nihue Rao Centro Espiritual. He is Colombian-American from Arizona, studied biology at UCLA, then med school at UCSD, completed family medicine residency at UCLA, then went on to do a postdoc in the Department of Psychiatry at UCSD, studying low-intensity, high-light therapy, and simultaneously psychoneuroimmunology. Dr. Tafur has been working in and around integrative medicine throughout and after his medical training, working on a variety of academic and community activities with traditional Chinese medicine and yoga practitioners, as well as energy healers. He's been studying traditional Shipibo plant medicine for the past 5 years and is now apprenticing under Ricardo Amaringo at the Nihue Rao Center. His primary interest at this time is in spiritual healing and in working to integrate practices like Amazonian shamanism and other traditional approaches with modern healthcare. Dr. Tafur's book, The Fellowship of the River, explores his extensive experience with ayahuasca and traditional medicine in the Amazon rainforest. And during his extensive work at the Peruvian Healing Center, Nihue Rao Centro Espiritual, Dr. Tafur studied traditional Amazonian plant medicine, or TAPM, and Shipibo shamanism under Master Ayahuasquero Ricardo Amaringo. At the center, he learned how shamanic approaches can help to heal modern health problems like anxiety, depression, PTSD, migraine headaches, and digestive problems. Dr. Tafur continues to work in both allopathic and shamanistic medicine and is focused on connecting the worlds of academic, medicine, and spiritual healing. In his years at Nihue Rao Centro Espiritual, he collected a number of integrative case studies from which he developed his theories about bridging modern medical understanding and the profound world of shamanic healing. Woven into the stories of his Amazonian adventures, Dr. Tafur has summarized these theories in his thought-provoking new book, The Fellowship of the River, a medical doctor's exploration into traditional Amazonian plant medicine. We're going to be speaking with Dr. Tafur from his home in Arizona. Dr. Tafur, welcome. It's so great to have you with us today. We're really honored.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'll just clear up one thing from the bio because it might be an older one.
Okay.
That, I don't know. I've been involved in the Amazon since 2007.
Mm-hmm.
And then more intensely studying since 2011.
Oh, thank you for the clarification.
Yeah, no problem.
So let's dive right in. Can you give us a brief history of, how did you get involved anyway with ayahuasca and the region, and then we'll kind of larger scope here.
Yeah, so I went to UCSD for medical school in San Diego. And I got depressed in medical school, and I was having a hard time, and I was like, I kind of get into all those topics in the book, and I tried a few different things. My dad is a psychiatrist, and I eventually, after kind of, benefiting a little bit from just normal treatment, but still not feeling quite well, I entered Peyote Ceremony in Arizona.
Mm-hmm.
I had an opportunity to try peyote in a kind of a spiritual ceremonial context.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a really profound healing. And so I felt a lot better, and I became very curious about plant medicine and the shamanism.
Mm-hmm.
And then my family is from Colombia, and I had heard about ayahuasca, or yahe as they call it in Colombia.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a family connection. My grandfather's best friend was a botanist that had spent some time in the Amazon, and so I was aware of that. And so because of the kind of profound uh, response that I had to peyote, and as I got to know more kind of medicine men or people that were working with peyote, I became very curious about. I wonder what they're doing down there, with ayahuasca.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wanted to go down, and I had an opportunity to go with a friend, and I had a very impactful experience. I was really taken personally by the experience, but also like very impressed by the kind of healing work that I was seeing happening,
Mm-hmm.
through this traditional kind of a medical system,
Mm-hmm.
and just the amazing results that I was observing. And so I started going back, and then for myself and to kind of learn more about it. And then eventually I started taking groups down and kind of got closer to the shamans. And then one of the shamans, Ricardo Marengo, was interested in starting his own place.
Mm-hmm.
And he invited myself and Svita Mamesh and a few other people to join him to start a new healing center, which was Niwerao.
Okay.
And so then, yeah, we did that.
Uh-huh. And that what year was that? How long have you been doing that?
Niwerao opened in 2011.
Okay.
So yeah, it's like really 2018. So it's really 8 years, because it's still, during the whole 2011.
Mm-hmm.
We started, we bought the property in 2010, started constructing, building, and so it's been working for about 8 years. But like at the end of 2016, I stepped out as a business partner and am selling my shares of the center to Ricardo.
Okay.
Yeah, but I still take groups there and consult with them.
Uh-huh. Can you give us a sense of what that Niue Rao looks like? You said you sold shares, and what is it a big piece of property with?
It's a big piece of property. Niue is like a 20-acre property in the
Okay.
forest, outside, about an hour and a half outside of town,
Mm-hmm.
up against a very large national park.
Mm-hmm.
And so then it's a retreat center, for kind of in a rustic kind of construction style, traditional style, with leaves, thatched roofs,
Mm-hmm.
and rooms for people to stay in. But then they also, there's showers and bathrooms, and there's a maloka for the ceremony, a ceremonial space. And there's also like little huts in the forest for people to do isolation if they want.
Mm-hmm.
And there's also, there's a space, there's an art maloka, and there's a space for people to do creative work.
Mm-hmm.
And there's also, there's a kitchen and a dining area and like all that kind of services that people have. And others, where it's a lot of land. So there's a soccer field and
Nice.
plenty of places to hang out.
Uh-huh.
And they have a website, niwerao.com,
Okay.
with a lot of photos.
Uh-huh. So it sounds beautiful. It sounds idyllic.
Yeah, it's very beautiful.
So when people come, do they stay for? Is it a set period of time, like a week?
Yeah, it's open ended there. The center is running throughout the year, and so people come for a minimum of 1 week. More typical stay is 10 days or maybe 2 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's other people that stay for a month, or sometimes 2 months or 3 months or 6 months or even a year.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so prolonged treatment.
Uh-huh. So how many people approximately have come through there since like 2000, you think?
Probably, I don't know, probably 1,000.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, maybe.
Is it one of the bigger ones down there? Or?
It's one. I mean, it is one of the bigger ones. There are some good sized ones, but I think property wise and it's been around, it's been functioning.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say it's one of the larger centers. Can hold like probably about, anywhere from like 15 to 20 people could be there at one time.
And are most people that come there, they're seeking treatment for particular disorders, conditions, or a combination of things? Just they want to try it, or
Yeah, I think we kind of that this place, like the shamans that work there, Ricardo and his team, they're serious about what they do, so they're not so interested in like, and they don't really think that's respectful, to try it, especially
just
not
try it.
in the
Yeah.
conditions in which what they're providing,
Mm-hmm.
and so they don't. So that's the minimum 1 week stay.
Mm-hmm.
Is kind of to try to minimize that, and then it's so far out, of people's way,
Mm-hmm.
and they have to kind of reserve and go through a screening process.
Mm-hmm.
So most of the people there are looking for help. There are people that want to explore, but in their exploration, usually inevitably something comes up,
Yeah.
that they want to work on.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, this kind of brings me to sort of, I don't know how much you want to talk about the history of psychedelics and altered states in general. Maybe that, I don't know if that's going to be the best use of our time or not, but I would just pose you the question, like, what is your take on
the history?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, now there's like Michael Pollan's book out, the like How to Change Your Mind, which is pretty comprehensive. Like, look at it. I have a little like section of a chapter on that, which is basically, well, we know there's been traditional use of different psychedelics all over the world,
Right.
for thousands of years, and so the obvious examples are, there's ayahuasca in South America and other related plants, and then there's the peyote, and then there's mushrooms, it's quite widespread. And Mexico is a famous place where they had a and they continue to have a tradition around like psilocybin mushrooms. But then there's mushroom traditional use, I guess, throughout like Europe and Asia as well, in North Africa and in Africa and beyond. And then there's iboga, in West Africa. And so those are some of the examples of what's been going on for thousands of years. And as far as like modern Western culture, or maybe just American society, it's kind of, in the early days, in the 40s and the 50s in Europe and North America, they discovered LSD, and they isolated psilocybin from the mushrooms that were being used, down, and they isolated mescaline, from the peyote, and they began to do research on it, and they were considered like very promising substances to learn about neuroscience and brain chemistry, and also human psychology and treatment of all kinds of forms of mental health problems, initially, including like, well, addiction was a big focus, but then other things, trauma related things. So then that was going on in the 40s and the 50s and into the 60s, and then LSD and things like that kind of leaked into the population at large,
right,
and were kind of being used outside of the clinical setting. And then eventually, that led to the whole thing, right? The psychedelic 60s and the hippies and everything. And that whole movement, which eventually kind of aggravated, the authorities. And then there were other concerns about just kind of reckless use.
Right.
And just like it's new to everyone. So, they're just like challenging to the establishment, and so there was a counter movement from the government to shut it all down. And so like in the late 60s, right? Pretty successfully in the late 60s and the early 70s, they stopped all psychedelic research and clinical kind of research with psychedelics. And then it started back up again. There's like the group MAPS that's based in the Bay Area right now. There's people that were trying to, in the 80s, I guess, that there was at some point MDMA was being used in psychotherapy, which, kind of became the like party drug ecstasy. And that became illegal. And so then there were a lot of people working to try to legalize that or find a legal pathway to bring back psychedelic psychotherapy. So that was brewing, and there's other people trying to do things. And then it was in the 90s that the University of New Mexico, Rick Strassman, started doing research with DMT, which is like the main psychedelic component of ayahuasca.
Mm-hmm.
And so they started to reopen those kind of trials, and eventually that led to research that's now going on at a number of universities, including like Johns Hopkins and UCLA and NYU and Imperial College of London. And so it's really, there's a renaissance in psychedelic research once again, and a second look at the responsible use, in which there's been benefits shown with things like anxiety and depression and PTSD and addiction.
Mm-hmm.
And so then meanwhile, like in the 90s probably, on the South American, more and more people started going to Peru, for example, to explore ayahuasca. And then these centers started popping up, and this ayahuasca tourism scene, I think by 2000 was a little more, there's a few centers, and, first time I went down there, 2007, there were some centers that were kind of larger scale and ready to receive people, and, working with translators and things like that to facilitate people's experience. So it wasn't just about like going out to the village and finding a shaman, it was like a place with a website that was inviting people. And that's how I went,
Yeah.
And then since then, like I said, all the psychedelic science research that's going on. And since then in Iquitos, it's blown up. There's many centers where many people have gone.
Yeah. It seems like we're beginning to, like you said, we're starting to see this renaissance in the use of psychedelics. In fact, some people are there. I think we were talking before we got on the air here about microdosing, and can you maybe elaborate a bit on this whole sort of dichotomy between, I guess we would call that the recreational sort of personal use side of things, where people are microdosing themselves with various substances, DMT or
right,
psilocybin or even LSD, versus the real, the guide-led therapeutic interventions that you're talking about that are really maybe more profound.
Yeah, I guess it's like, microdosing is going on with all these different substances, and I guess it's like more popular and being talked about in like peak performance kind of discussions. So, and really, I guess most people, I think a lot of people that are microdosing are like trying to treat something, I think that's like, a lot of people I think are like exploring that as an antidepressant kind of effect, and so I don't know, it's kind of like been popularized as this like, oh yeah, peak performance, but it's kind of weird because I don't know what that means exactly, like being better at something you don't like, or what does that mean,
Right.
It's like this kind of a confused kind of materialist approach, to me. But I'm not against it, because I think a lot of people they gain benefit, and it's out there, and I don't think it should be illegal. And so that being said, and then there's the recreational use, which probably a lot of us have had recreational experiences. Some of them have been a lot of fun, some of them are troubling, and some of them maybe have been very profound.
Right.
And and then in the case of something like ayahuasca, where there's this traditional kind of plant medicine system that's kind of still working from this ancestral experience, there's another level of perhaps like what can be done, and that's why I explore, because there's a lot of people, just to touch on one concept related is like a DMT, so then people have the DMT, and so they think, you work with Chinese medicine and all this stuff, and so you get this reductionist approach,
right?
They're like, oh, we have DMT, and the only reason the Amazonians don't smoke DMT is because they're so primitive,
right?
That they don't have a laboratory, to isolate, versus like whole plant medicine, herbal medicine,
right.
With Chinese medicine would be the perfect example to discuss. It's not the same thing having a molecule of glucose as eating a chocolate cake,
right?
Like it's just not. And it's
Right.
not the same thing as, swallowing a handful of caffeine or
Mhm.
drinking some tea.
Right.
It's not. And THC is not the same as marijuana, et cetera, and
Yeah.
all the isolated things and multi-plant mixes. And so that's just one thing. But, so it's this reductionist approach, and, that people want to have access to something, and they have access to that.
Mm-hmm.
But like with people smoking DMT, where I think a lot of people have reported a lot of amazing experiences, and some people have reported like profound healing experiences, and some people have reported problems,
Mm-hmm.
like managing these really severe or intense altered states.
Mm-hmm.
And but I haven't seen those people reporting the kind of healing, like for example, that's described in the book.
Mm-hmm.
Where people are really making like real serious gains. Although some people are, like let's say with microdosing, I mean, in a way, it's like a treatment, right? Like,
Right.
what's the difference between microdosing and taking Prozac?
Mm-hmm.
It's like it's in the same ballpark. It's different, and you can get it yourself,
Mm-hmm.
but it's like it's a chemical treatment, and ideally you would be making some gains so that you wouldn't necessarily need that, right? That's what
Yeah.
the hope is. So it's like once you're treated, okay, you moved up to another stage, and like Ken Wilber talks about, like, there's state changes and there's stage changes,
Mm-hmm.
and so, and not that you're necessarily going to achieve that with ayahuasca, but there's pathways within the tradition to try to make the most of it, which is what we're also seeing with the psychedelic assisted psychotherapy.
Mm-hmm.
When they have this big trials for PTSD, that's a very famous trial from, MAPS, the MDMA trial.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of people are taking MDMA, all over the place, right? They all partied with MDMA, but they're not getting the kind of results that these guys are getting,
Right.
and these guys are only doing 2 or 3 sessions of MDMA.
Right.
And so it's like, it's in the context of this advanced therapeutic approach.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's a perfect example, and that's why I promote that a lot. It's like psychedelic assisted psychotherapy
Mm-hmm.
is turning out to be way more effective than just psychedelics. And in that same sense, like traditional ceremonial contexts
Mm-hmm.
in which people explore, ayahuasca, or let's say even mushrooms or whatever it is
Mm-hmm.
quite different, than what people might just get from their own experimentation. For the simple reason that, and in Chinese medicine is a perfect example. I'm a doctor. I can go take a short course in acupuncture,
Mm-hmm.
and I'll get the license and I can do it.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like, does that is an ignorance of the philosophy underlying Chinese medicine limit my practice?
Mm-hmm.
Well, in fact, yes, it does.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like, it's a fact,
Yeah.
and that's based on experience of actual practitioners.
Right.
So it's that kind of discussion where experience teaches wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you don't, like I bring it up all the time, architecture is like that. Somebody didn't just figure it out by themselves because they're such a prodigy,
Mm-hmm.
that was like received the revelation and the message
Yeah.
that they know how to do it. It's like, actually, it's built on like hundreds and thousands of years of experience that allow us to live in the kind of buildings we live in today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a really important point. Well, you made a couple of really important points. Obviously, the synthesis of DMT is definitely not the same as the whole plant structure and all the molecules and all of the interaction between the plant terpenes and flavonoids and whatever else is in there, and just the magic of the whole plant, if you will. And
exactly.
then the guide aspect, the teacher aspect, and the even the group. If they're in the group or they're
sure. It's very impactful. Like, there's no question that, and that's a lot of that's part of what's missing for people, and that's what I think can be so therapeutic for people in places like Niue Rao and in kind of ayahuasca retreat center that's run well, that's run responsibly. There's a lot of ways it could go wrong, but is that, like, I bring it up a lot, is Malidoma Somé, an African shaman. He says, well, what's missing in the West is they're disconnected from nature, they're disconnected from community, and they're disconnected from spirit, and so those are 3 things that really, you could he makes the argument that this really disturbing to the mental health of a society.
Sounds like a bad place to be.
It sounds like USA. you
Yeah.
know, and I mean,
Well,
our
the
Western
Western
culture,
world, yeah,
the Western
I would
world, you
say,
know.
yeah, for sure.
Yeah, so then it's hard on us as human beings. So once you get people,
Yeah.
you know, into a natural setting in a retreat center, that's healing, and we have this forest bathing research and all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And then you get them in community, you know, because a lot of these problems are rooted in relationship problems,
Mm-hmm.
you know, whether it's childhood stuff and those kind of things that affect people's emotional development.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, so you sometimes you need a social solution, you
Yeah.
know, to help people work these things out and allow the social kind of community to create a network to allow people to kind of explore things that alone is just too high voltage.
Mm-hmm.
And then the last part is like, you know, some kind of mystical um, context where, you know, a simple concept like hope, you know,
Yeah.
could actually be like celebrated and not like, you know, um I don't know, become this like topic of some kind of intellectualization.
Mm-hmm.
It's like you want your children to hope, you know.
Yeah.
So it's like this, you allow the common sense, like I say, where the mystery, you know, what's mystical, what's spiritual. I guess to me, it's like those things which we experience that are beyond the understanding of our mind. But the key point is that we experience them.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's what we're talking about. We're not talking about some made up thing. I'm talking about something that somebody went through and they lived it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, so they're, you know, in other words, we don't have to deny strange phenomena happening to us in our own life,
Mm-hmm.
you know. And there's a huge, like in the Western kind of scientific rational point of view, it's like, well, that's kind of like the first step is like all of a sudden everyone's going to throw away
Yeah.
their subjective experience of this life.
Yeah.
It's which is ultimately like very foolish, and you wouldn't do that, you know,
Mm-hmm.
in a dialogue with a loved one. You know, people do, but it's you know, ultimately considered a very cold-hearted kind of approach to take with somebody. You
Mm-hmm.
know, and it's going to hurt somebody, and it's going to cause problems. You know, if you can't like try to have some kind of compassion and understanding to some of the mysteries that people experience.
Mm-hmm. You know, it sounds a little bit like what you're saying is that these substances, ayahuasca, et cetera, psilocybin, and I've read this and I've experienced it. They they're the keys, sort of, to unlock the door a bit.
Yeah, you know, that's what a lot of people say. So then they kind of like, in the case of ayahuasca, like I think there's a further like therapeutic experience, you know, and you know, so that again, get into the thing of the purge.
Mm-hmm.
So this considered, that's just, you know, primitive. I
Mm-hmm.
don't want to purge. I don't like purging. So, you know, just smoke the DMT.
Right.
But it's like that kind of visceral response
Mm-hmm.
quite often is like a big part of people's healing experience.
Mm-hmm.
And so then, you know, just like with the somatic experience therapy and, you know, transformational breath work or, you know, other forms of somatic release, you know, even acupuncture,
Mm-hmm.
you know, or tuina massage or whatever it is, but like mobilizing energetics in
Mm-hmm.
the body, you
Mm-hmm.
know, and allowing something to shift and change
Mm-hmm.
or facilitating that. So there's, you know, there is that aspect, you know, just to comment, because in the tradition down there, all over the Amazon, like the tea is never named for the DMT containing plant.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's named for the ayahuasca. The
Mm-hmm.
ayahuasca is seen as the vine is seen as the, you know, the grandmother of it all. And that the visions, you know, they can be informative and they can be revealing, but that the power of the medicine is not there. The healing is not there.
Mm-hmm.
So that there's a healing power, you know, in the vine itself. And so that, you know, so that distinguishes a little bit in the sense that it's not relying on the pure psychedelic experience. However, you know, the psychedelic experience is a very, you know, significant part of it.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's that key, you know, and that's what they talk about. You know, for somebody who's very, let's say, blocked
Mm-hmm.
to, they never received any kind of cultural or family education. about mystical experiences or about like opening your heart, you know, or overcoming your ego. And then all of a sudden, you know, they have a direct experience of that. You know, maybe it's just for a few hours, but they become aware that exists. And so there's that, and then there's this like deconditioning aspect. You know, that's what Terence McKenna said a lot. Like, this is a deconditioning agent. You know, so in other words, like, how do you get somebody to open their mind and become aware of some part of themselves that they've kind of like scarred over, shut down, and all of a sudden it opens these gates, you know, and you become aware of all kinds of things.
So what are those gates? You have training in psychoneuroimmunology.
Yeah.
What are they? What are we seeing in the research?
Well, the research is talking about, like, one of the focus areas of the research is like partially from several different people. One of the big schools, Imperial College of London, and with their research with psilocybin, this has been replicated with ayahuasca, and you know, I think they've also been looking at the other substances. Is there's this talk of this default mode network in the brain. Okay, so that there's this DMN, default mode network, which is a series of kind of networks that are communicating with each other. That is being, like, Imperial College of London, in one of their papers, they talk about it like maybe this is the neural correlate of the ego. You know, like, this is, and the reason they say that is because when people have, in their research study, ego dissolution experiences described, you know, they see dramatic shifts in the activity of this default mode network. And so then they're saying that this is like the experience of ego dissolution, which is associated with this thing is kind of like a filter, you know. So it's, what is it associated with? Like, there's more default mode network activity, or I mean, it's a certain kind of activity. So it's further characterized than just like more or less, you know, there's some qualities of it. And so more of it, you know, when you have like overactive mental activity, a lot of rumination. So it's like sense of yourself, sense of your own like story, sense of your own, you know, time traveling in your mind, thinking about the past, you know, the stories that you really, that are like really strong with your concept of your own identity. You know, they're associated with activity or this kind of overactivity. Similarly, overactivity in default mode network has been noted in things like anxiety and depression, you know, with this overactive thinking and addiction and, you know, like PTSD. So it's like, and even things like, you know, my friends at USC, and they're looking at default mode network and in relation to meditation. So meditation has a similar effect on this default mode network, you know, maybe more lasting, you know, with regular practice. So with the same kind of idea that it's like, it's relaxing this ego mental kind of, you know, activity. And then that allows for more free-flowing, like, sensory integration to come from the senses, okay, from the outer world. So people are more aware. They're not so stuck in their heads, as people would say. You know, they're more aware and perceptive to the world around them. And there's also more free flow from the interoception. You know, in other words, the sense of the internal feelings inside their body, which are, you know, closely linked to the state of their health and their function, but also very interrelated to their emotions. So then there's a lot of emotional content that comes forward that is otherwise suppressed, you know. So then you can imagine like a situation where, and this is like theory, you know, but it's based on this evidence that's being demonstrated, that, let's say, like some heavy trauma where the system is just overwhelmed and really can't afford to feel that feeling anymore.
Right.
And so you kind of scar over and you get this excess default mode network activity to kind of like close down, you know, gates and feelings within. And so then that's, you know, so then one of the strange phenomena that happens is a lot of people like have repressed memories, come back,
Mm-hmm.
often of trauma.
Yeah, so that's interesting that you say that, and I know that we talked a little bit earlier about purging, and like in a lot of traditional cultures, we have to. They do this. They take some time and prepare the body, prepare the mind before they go in. And it sounds like this default mode network now is sort of we're looking at that. Is that found in multiple areas of the brain, or is it just in the hippocampus, or is it?
No, it's like it's not just in the hippocampus. It's like it's kind of like you'd have to look it up, and I'm not a total like expert but it's multiple areas that are linked.
Okay.
Kind of like to kind of like it seems to me like somewhere at the interface of the cortex and the limbic system.
Yeah. Interesting.
So it's like this prefrontal cortex and this other, these other little parts. And in the book, I mentioned them, and then I show, I cite the papers for people who want to learn more about it. Mm-hmm. But it's a very real thing. It's a big focus, and it's also a big focus in meditation research, because it's like, well, if depression and all these things are associated with this default mode network activity. Mm-hmm. And it's funny because in the culture, if you have a culture that's kind of like promoting kind of dysfunctional default mode network activity, then you see these kind of epidemics of anxiety, depression, and then you see that somehow like these spiritual approaches like are like helpful,
Yeah.
Like this ego dissolution activity is part of what like opens things up, perhaps in some cases, to allow for certain like stunted emotional processes to complete and resolve. Mm-hmm. And so then you allow like, so functioning, is able to flow again. Kind of like some kind of blockage or stagnation. Mm-hmm. That would have it would be multiple areas of the body involved, but this is part of it. So in the focus of neuroscience, like that's been a big hot topic, and it's just real interesting with the meditation that it's just going together. Mm-hmm. And then there's this one other extra piece, that is also consistent in like a lot of the research and people's experience in the psilocybin research is once you do this, once you kind of get people towards this ego dissolution, and then we hear about this in meditation as well, then quite often people have a mystical experience.
Yeah.
It's like in the psilocybin research, it's like, wow, that's very high, percentage. So they're saying, wow, this is kind of how it works. Like turn off the default mode network, and then all of a sudden you kind of get this access to something else.
Yeah. It's like like you said, the deconditioning agent.
Yeah, exactly.
The switch is flipped off or on, whatever you want, however you want to describe it. Yeah. So
it allows for, so it's this catalyst that allows for something to reorganize, and that's one of the ways some people, and again, that's like this larger context, like how do we help people reorganize in some effective way? Like they're doing with this psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, where they're getting these high percentage results of lasting effects. And so it's like, okay, so you prepare them just like we prepare the people to some degree in the Amazon traditionally, like you said, with a vomitive and with a particular diet, and try to like lay down the groundwork. In Ayurveda, they do a lot of vomitives and enemas and all kinds of stuff like that.
Sure.
And then, I've run into that in South Africa as well. Traditional medicine, they do a lot of vomitives and, steam, vapor baths and all that kind of stuff, which I think is all associated to this, the release of some of this emotional, trauma quite often.
Yeah, so that's kind of even seeped its way into, America, and I don't know about the rest of the Western civilization, but this concept of, it sort of exists in this concept of detoxifying, right? I mean, liver detoxes are everywhere. So it's in our consciousness, our collective consciousness to a certain degree.
We know we have to detoxify, and so like what's a little, what the book is trying to say, and I think like Chinese medicine, for example, is very fluid, and like kind of like the emotional connection to physical disturbance. But the book is trying to make that connection like within the Western medical model, and say that, like when like in Chinese medicine, where we have concepts like the triple warmer,
Right.
this kind of the holistic kind of system that's managing, multiple dimensions of activity. And so then that's when we start about this default mode network. And then I get into like the psychoneuroimmunology stuff, because that's this whole mind body research that's kind of delineated this constellation of elements of your psychology that are connected to parts of the brain, and let's say in the limbic system, the emotional brain, and the way that's wired directly into your autonomic nervous system, which is controlling digestion and heart rate and blood pressure and all that kind of stuff. And these holistic kind of body responses and sweating and the expression of your emotions, whether it's blushing or your stomach rumbling, in response to some kind of anxiety, or whatever, anxious diarrhea, sweating,
Right.
So it's like this is where the emotions are expressed on the kind of from that Western model. And then you have that is directly wired into the immune system. And so we see these inflammatory responses to, stress, for example, with cortisol levels changing, and, poor wound healing, as we kind of started out this conversation, or earlier we were talking about, or and then the endocrine system, hormonal imbalance related to that, with the cortisol and adrenaline, being the most obvious examples, with connection to this fight or flight and stress and emotional trauma. So where you have PTSD is, and that's what I'm trying to make the argument. Like this is a disease of the emotional body. So it's not simply like a psychological problem. It's not simply a, brain disease. Like all these elements are disturbed. A lot of these people have, heart rate problems and blood pressure problems and inflammation problems in their blood and hormonal disturbances, a number of different kinds of hormonal disturbances. And so it's this idea of like, okay, so we can see now where multiple elements of the emotional body are disturbed. As I'm defining the emotional body, I'm saying this is the psychoneural endocrine immunologic network. So in other words, we could talk about liver meridian and anger and stuff like that in Chinese medicine, but where can I point to in the body, in the Western medical system, where it's like, okay, obviously this person went through an emotional trauma.
Right.
This is a combat veteran that went through war. And now we see disturbances in all these different systems that I'm describing.
Right.
And then we can show that through a deep emotional healing process, those resolve, not just in the brain, not just in the psychology, but some of these people's, cardiovascular function improves, their inflammatory function improves, some of their hormonal functions improve. And so it's this diffuse thing. And so I'm saying that's a disease of the emotional body.
Yeah.
And traditional medicine, like in the Amazon and, even in Chinese medicine, where you have like, discussions of energetics flowing through the body. And then you see how, at least that's one area where this energies, which can be connected to mystical, things, phenomena. It's like, well, it's a lot of times in this case of the emotional trauma where we're talking about, and what the shamans would say, when they see somebody who has a problem, like I said, of multiple elements of the emotional body, they'd say, this is a spiritually ill person. This is what soul sickness looks like,
Yeah.
And so that's kind of the argument that I make in the book, is like, when you see somebody who has that kind of disturbances, like, like Ricardo says, and, we're not including Chinese medicine because I'm just as an MD.
Yeah.
It's like, hey, pills or surgery, that's not going to fix that.
Right.
Their problem is energetic. and it involves, kind of more subtle energies, including like whatever accumulates in their body in response to emotional toxicity, not just from their nutrition and whatever, pharmaceuticals, carcinogens, but from, difficult experiences in their life. And that accumulates in there. And how do we release that and purge that and process that so that they can then kind of move past that?
Yeah.
And then you see these physical improvements, like in the book, I talk about a migraine headache case, with a pretty dramatic resolution, and a Crohn's disease case, and I know people can respond to Chinese medicine for those kind of problems as well. But once again, that approach is, open to the possibility of this, like these other energies being involved, and more mystical or open-minded approaches to try to, how do you address that,
Right.
versus just trying to limit it to, migraine is a brain disease. And, in the book I draw on, I'm like, hey, you know what? They never taught me this in medical school, but there's a significant amount of research where they're saying migraine might be a maladaptive stress response to childhood trauma. And I bring it up in the book. It's like the reason that crossed my mind, and I'm not saying it's true in every case, but in some cases, and the cases that we were seeing down there, like these people grew up in very aggressive households where there was a lot of screaming and yelling. And it made sense that they might have some kind of sensory, wires crossed from that overwhelming. And now all of a sudden a smell or the light or a sound pushes them into this kind of maladaptive stress response.
Yeah.
So it's so then really the nature of their problem is rooted in that initial trauma. So how do we deal with that and process that? And at least in the case presented, and something it's wow, you can see some really big changes.
Yeah. Yeah, they really are diseases of the spirit. I mean, we see it clinically all the time. Everybody that comes in, even with shoulder pain or knee pain or toe pain, has some sort of a spiritual aspect of their disorder.
Exactly.
I wanted to ask you, you mentioned the veteran, and I mean, these people are coming, our vets are coming back.
Right.
Just completely far left of center, or right of center, however you want to describe it.
Right.
Serious diseases of the spirit. So how do we protect, when we're doing an ayahuasca journey or any psilocybin trip or whatever, how is what are the safety concerns, I guess, or what are the dangers?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of dangers, first of all, in the case of ayahuasca, where there's this other, the ayahuasca vine, which has these MAOI inhibitors, the monoamine oxidase inhibitors. So those are known to have potentially, not necessarily for sure that's going to be toxic, but there's potential drug interactions, with that. So then that really then people, we worry about people trying to make psychiatric medications with those drugs. And you could potentially push somebody into this serotonin syndrome that could be very dangerous and even lethal. And so the idea that you need to really, and there's a lot of other drugs that interact with MAO inhibitors. So you need to be very careful at that level, of okay, what else is being mixed in? And even there are some dietary concerns to consider of things you don't want to mix with monoamine oxidase inhibitors. So there's that. And then now you have just the full blown psychedelic, and what's that going to do to somebody? And then you have, cardiovascular risks. If somebody is known to be at risk of heart attack and stroke, and they might have a very intense trip, or intense experience, and they could have a heart attack. People have had heart attacks in ayahuasca and in peyote and other kinds of, psychedelic experiences. Or even a stroke, like I mentioned, blood pressure can go up and things like that.
Yeah.
And then you have the concern about people who are, have a, predisposition or previously had problems with psychosis, like schizophrenia, and then in bipolar in particular, people have had manic episodes. So the psychedelics, and in particular ayahuasca, can be destabilizing to those people and push them into a really problematic psychotic state or manic state. and I've witnessed this and prolonged, weeks, days to weeks, and requires psychedelic intervention to bring them down. So that's a real concern. So those are like always a big part of the screening. And then there's just the mystery of like, we don't know exactly. There's not a lot of studies to say, oh, mixing this medication or that medication, and so there's a lot of gray area there, because some of these people are taking multiple meds, not just psych meds, but meds for other problems. And so that all has to be considered. That being said, somebody with PTSD, let's say a war vet, they could definitely be pushed into some kind of like very fearful, violent state, and it's happened. And so you want to be dealing with like very advanced practitioners with a lot of the support in place, to help these people. And so, that's kind of like ultimately part of it is like, like any kind of medical profession, it's like, cause you've done it before,
right?
When you're seeing somebody and you can tell them, yeah, I've helped somebody with this before. And so that's like the confidence, that you draw from. And so, I know there's a lot of excitement, and there's places that are focused on that, and everybody wants to look. And so that, it's a potential, and it's just very powerful. And I think there's a movie coming out, From Shock to Awe. San Diego's a big vet community. And so there's all that kind of stuff going on. So there is a lot of promise. And in the interim, something that'll be like maybe softer for some of those people and maybe less risk will be the MDMA assisted psychotherapy, which is coming down the line, and the research study is expanding in this year and next year, with a plan to make it available in 2 years to patients. Like, it's gotten to that point. It's at that level where the FDA, they're in their final phase of trial with the FDA because of the results that they're getting. They're kind of getting fast tracked. And so that'll be, something.
That's huge.
And so that'll be available to those guys. And sometimes, maybe some of them are going to benefit more from that. Maybe some of them will benefit more from ayahuasca. And so it's just, it's about, but when it comes to ayahuasca, there's legal concerns, it's not really legal in the United States.
Right.
And
Schedule 1, right?
Schedule 1 DMT.
Yeah.
And so there's the Brazilian churches that have a DA exemption, a couple of them. And there's other people looking for the exemption, or in the process of getting an exemption. And so then, there'll be more avenues eventually. But then, again, it's back to this experience factor.
Yeah.
It's like there's one thing, it's like fresh out of Chinese medical school, fresh out of medical school versus somebody that's tried and true.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It was, even today, and it's amazing that, people are just having more open conversations about psychedelics in general these days. I think, we're almost at a tipping point. We're not quite there yet, obviously, but
right. It is shifting. Yeah.
It's shifting. And I don't know if you've seen this, but I'm sure you have. One of my students, I was talking to her today on a clinic shift earlier. And I said, you look a little tired, and she said, oh, I'm tired. We had a busy weekend, went to a concert. I was like, oh yeah. She said, I said, did you party pretty hard? And she said, yeah, I kind of, we did some mushrooms. And I was like, wow, she did mushrooms at a concert, like with thousands of people. I'm like,
yeah,
wow, that's a totally different trip, man.
It's totally different, but that's how a lot of people used to do it. Like that was it. Like that's a Grateful Dead show. That's a Fish show.
It was.
That's Burning Man. Burning Man. It's like,
yeah, that's exactly where it was.
Everybody's there.
Revival.
Yeah, exactly. And so, yeah, for me, like, I did when I was younger. I had a few experiences like that and a lot of people have, and that was the LSD and the whole hippies thing. They were just doing it. But again, like once you kind of get in touch with kind of the ceremonial aspect and the spiritual aspect,
yeah,
and it's like it's hard to take it that way,
right? Right. I was thinking, the last time I did mushrooms, just completely candidly, was years ago when I was in my 20s, and I didn't. The thought of being at a concert or indoors even was just kind of horrifying. I just went outside here and at Torrey Pines Park, walking around in the pine trees, and watching the plants breathe, and
yeah.
So
a lot of people would prefer that. I think just right off the bat.
Right.
But then there's this big kind of, experience that a lot of people go for,
Mm-hmm.
and that some of them have a blast, and
Yeah.
that's all the MDMA and all that kind of stuff, and
Yeah.
just partying, and
Yep.
but there's the same risks are there,
Mhm.
and that's why, like, for example, MAPS, they run the Zendo project at Burning Man. They have kind of like a psychedelic emergency crew.
Oh, okay.
So that's part of like this tipping point,
Uh-huh.
is the responsible use, and not like denying, like, hey, guess what? This could really, this could put you into a problem.
Mm-hmm.
And so you better make sure you have a solution to that problem,
Mm-hmm.
if you're going to take these risks. And I think that a lot of those big festivals are addressing that now with like the Zendo project and things like that.
Yeah, that's
So
great.
it's, so there's a maturity around it that needs to be there for this kind of tipping point to move forward.
Mm-hmm. So you think the future looks bright?
I think it does. I think it's kind of like, there's this thing happening. My brother made the comment to me that, and a lot of people are saying this, and like Michael Pollan, his book is kind of, I've been listening to it a little bit, and it's like he's kind of like a late end baby boomer.
Sure.
So he was like 12 or something in the late 60s.
Right.
So he kind of missed it, and he said he caught it when it was already like, don't do drugs.
Right. Right.
And so that's what he saw it, but he didn't see it.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, like, so many people around him and a little bit older than him are experienced with the stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's one factor, is that there's a lot of people who are now in kind of the elder position in our society throughout the country that have tried this stuff.
Right.
It's like very prevalent.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's different from what they were dealing with their parents.
Right.
Who are just like, whoa, what is this? This is not good.
Right.
Versus like, well, I tried it, it's not that, so there's that factor.
Mm-hmm.
And then you see the factor that like MAPS is really big and open about pushing in their policy kind of movement, is medicalization leads to legalization.
Mm-hmm.
So that was what their focus was with marijuana.
Mm-hmm.
And they said they had a lot of polling data that showed that people who voted to legalize marijuana, or even medical marijuana, or I guess it was legalized marijuana, was not because they smoked, but because they knew somebody that benefited from medical marijuana.
Right.
And that's what caused the shift. So then all the psychedelic research is going down that same road very openly.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we've learned this from the marijuana experience. So once the MDMA trial, becomes what it is, already become, and the psilocybin trial is right behind it. Mm-hmm. So they've got MDMA and psilocybin like on the train to become, I guess, rescheduled or something, within 2 to 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
So then that's going to be like household, like, you're like, yeah, I did the psilocybin, in my psychedelic assisted psychotherapy clinic.
Mm-hmm.
And so then once that's like, then you don't have to hide it, it becomes a discussion.
Right.
So those things are moving forward, and I think a lot of the community is behind those things moving forward.
Mm-hmm.
And the old guard resistance, and when it comes to Schedule 1, where these three categories, I'll finish here in a second, but there's these three criteria, I think it's like that they're addictive, that they're harmful,
right,
and that they have no known medicinal use.
Right. So
those are the legal criteria, of which like none of these substances are meeting that criteria.
Right. None of that's true.
Yeah. So it's like, and it's now the research, because of this new research, the evidence is there.
Right.
To prove that that's not true.
Right.
And so as the evidence continues, it's just like more and more promising. And as they touch the conservative elements of the society, like helping war veterans, like helping elders with end of life anxiety, which is, two of the major focuses of the research right now. It's like, it touches a lot of people. They're doing war vets, they're doing police, they're doing firefighters. So this is not like, new age targets, And so it's wider reaching.
Yeah, I guess in small doses, I was just thinking about useful uses for pediatric trauma too. I guess it could be applicable in very small doses too.
Sure. I mean, that'll eventually, and you see the kind of apparently liberal attitude towards psych medication and children. That's like everywhere.
Right.
Like they're trying to figure out. They give it to them first and then figure out, should we do that?
Yeah, Ritalin candy.
Ritalin candy, or even antidepressants, or anxiety medication. It's like whatever. They don't want them to drink, but they'll give them that.
Right.
And so eventually, you would see that there would be probably a place for that. Especially like it's like to nip some early trauma in the bud. Like maybe there's a pathway for that, but again, very carefully and responsibly.
Yeah, anything we can do to help society become more kind and empathetic, I think we would welcome, right?
And so that's one little plug I would make. Well, first the plug for the book, of course, Fellowship of the River. But what's come out of the book, and I think it lends itself a lot to the cause of Chinese medicine, and the UCLA Center for East-West Medicine, for instance, Dr. Huey is like very interested in these concepts, is like the epigenetics.
Oh yeah.
So then the epigenetics is a big topic, so we don't have to get so into it. But my point is like that was one of my realizations, and one of the like theories that I'm trying to get behind. The book is trying to culminate and like look at this. It looks like probably the epigenetics are the ones that are responding to some of this like subtle, energetic, emotional shifts.
Yeah.
And making the argument for why that seems to be the case. And how it relates to each one of the illnesses that's proposed. And so we could see like, obviously herbal medicine would have a lot of epigenetic possibilities in general. But so now the MDMA trial with PTSD from MAPS, which is now moving to this large scale trial, has agreed to allow us, this organization that I've started with, a nonprofit called Modern Spirit, to collect saliva samples on the people going through the study to look for epigenetic changes, within like elements of the psychoneuroendocrine immunologic system, whether it's, white blood cells or something, but finding the epigenetic changes that would be linked to their emotional healing. And so that's happening. So we're raising money for that.
Fantastic.
It's modernspirit.org.
Well, Dr. Tafur, I think we've explored this topic
yes
greatly, and I just really appreciate you taking the time and sharing your vast wealth of knowledge with us and our listeners today. We'll link to your website through our Pacific Center link, and I really, really have enjoyed the conversation today. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much for your thoughtful approach.
All right.
I appreciate it.
I hope to join you down the Amazon sometime.
Yeah, let's do it.
That would be fun.
Let's do it.
Take care.
All right, you too.